Marian Werkheiser, one of the founding members of Cultural Heritage Partners, their office is in Richmond. They came to us in 2018 when we first got recognition, and we were fighting an issue just like they talked about today. And they came in and educated me and helped me to fight and win that battle. They have then come in as our general counsel for 5-6 years, and they taught us so much about how to build our tribal government. They have been on the front lines for the tribes in Virginia. They were able to get the executive order for consultation through. Now they were able to get the bill through for consultation. They were able to get the ombudsman position, which we are still waiting to hear who is going to get that. But this person will be a tribal liaison in the governor's office that will protect and negotiate and facilitate negotiations between the state and the tribes. Such a pivotal and important position. They have helped to write our consultation policies, our policies for governance, our constitutions. I can't even tell you how much. And they have been there to protect our cultural resources in all of the areas around us. And Marian, could you come up? And we love you.
Thank you.
First of all, when we were floundering and didn't know where to go, these people were our guiding light. And you've helped us all so much. And I like to give credit where credit is due. And so I want to say, it says, thank you, Cultural Heritage Partners, for the amazing work you've done for the Virginia tribes, for all of us. We love you.
With my colleagues from CHP, raise your hands. There's several of us here. Thank you so much. It's a true honor to work for the tribes and some of the most meaningful work that we do at the firm, and really surprised and appreciate this recognition. Thank you all.
The other person could not be here today. I was with him yesterday. It's Delegate Paul Krizek. His aide was supposed to be here, but she told me she had to leave before lunch. And so I just want to recognize him because he has been a champion for us here in the General Assembly. And as most of you tribal people know, the General Assembly has been a hard place for us because of past history and kind of colonialized mindsets. And so to have someone that is so open to hear our stories and have a heart for our experience here and a heart for justice, he's done an amazing job in supporting us and heading up legislation. The Code Commission that Cultural Heritage Partners got through the General Assembly, he is chairing that right now. Changing the Code of Virginia to support the federal recognized tribes and to make place for us because there was no place for us in the Virginia Code. So I say, running strong for American Indian Youth, he is also on their board, and they made a donation to this conference that will half take care of next year's conference. So thank you for your generosity and support. And I know you're out there listening, so I just want to say thank you so much for all that you do for the Virginia tribes. We love you.
We are going to go into our afternoon session now, which is on tribal consultation and cultural resources. And I'm going to read a little bit about Dr. Julia King, who has done some really amazing work in partnership with many of the tribes to actually following along on that sentiment of indigenous cultural landscapes and really digging into history. And it's really sad to hear when elders pass away, because that is knowledge and that is history and those are stories. So Julia's been doing a really wonderful job to work with the tribes and really support that oral history and documentation of indigenous cultural knowledge. So Julia King has 30 years of experience studying, writing, and teaching about historical archaeology and Chesapeake history and culture. She's held fellowships with Harvard University's Dumbarton Oaks, the Virginia Historical Society, and the Winterthur Museum, and has received 6 major grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities, including for one to work with the Rappahannock tribe to document their historic and ancestral landscapes. So her current research focus and why she's here today is because her focus is on Indigenous history and colonialism in the Chesapeake region. Thank you very much, Julia. Dr. King, please come up.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you all for being here this afternoon and not out there on that dessert tray. So, and I want to begin, is my slide up? Yep. By thanking Chief Ann Richardson for inviting me to present at this year's Sovereignty Conference. Now, Chief Ann asked me to talk about tribal consultation on cultural resources, and in some ways, I may not be the best choice to talk on that topic. I have never worked for a cultural resources management firm, and although I spent 19 years, it's hard to believe, working for the Maryland Historical Trust, which is Maryland State Historic Preservation Office, or SHPO, I was off in the museum end of the world, not in Annapolis, and not in what is still called, I think, review and compliance. My blissful ignorance changed somewhat when on April 1st is key here, 2003, I received a voicemail message at work claiming to be from the White House and asking me to call them back. Yeah, right. I got you on speed dial. Now, I worked with a bunch of pranksters at that museum, and I was well acquainted with their ongoing shenanigans. But as it turned out, it wasn't a prank at all. But the real White House Office of Personnel calling to ask if I would be willing to serve as an expert member on the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. The council, or ACHP as it is sometimes called, is a federal agency, and I'm sure many of you know, that was created to promote the preservation, enhancement, and sustainable use of the nation's diverse historic resources, and also to advise the President and the Congress on matters of national historic preservation policy. The ACHP is also the federal agency that administers the requirements of the National Historic Preservation Act, including Section 106, which we heard a lot about this morning. And the council also maintains an Office of Native American Affairs, overseeing the council's Native American responsibilities and initiatives. Aside from the fact that I had to buy a whole new wardrobe, I explained to the nice lady that I was a staunch Democrat. This was during the Bush II administration, but she said, not a problem. And so began a journey that over the course of 8 years introduced me to people from dozens of federally recognized tribes, Native Hawaiian organizations, and Alaskan Natives. Hailing from the East Coast, it was a steep learning curve for me, and it was a curve that transformed how I think about the work I do as an archaeologist, how I could use my background in archaeology to serve tribes and the other communities that my students and I work with, and how truly problematic some of the nation's grand historical narratives really are. Every step of the way, on this journey, I was exposed to the importance of big C consultation at the federal level, and often enough, and unfortunately, its failures. I learned how tribal consultation was, for many, although not all, but many federal agencies, simply a box to be checked. I learned how tribal concerns were often thrown into a box labeled archaeology, and I came to fully grasp the irony of my position as the archaeologist on the council who was told to deal with Native American issues, and the misunderstanding of tribal issues and the misunderstanding of archaeology, not by tribes and not by the council, but by the general public. I saw how placing tribes into the archaeology box, and only the archaeology box, reinforced narratives of indigenous disappearance. I saw how often talking to an archaeologist, and we heard this morning, not a tribal representative, was deemed tribal consultation. I came to see just how difficult, willfully or otherwise, it was for people to understand the unique government-to-government relationship between tribes and the federal government, how people misunderstood NAGPRA, sometimes calling it reverse racism, whatever that phrase even means, how consultation meant to so many regulators just another box to be checked, how expensive consultation can be for tribes, and how exhausting it was for tribes to have to fight for by right consulting party status. As I say this, I want to be clear that I am not describing life at the council. The ACHP has worked against this grain for decades, although I am aware that people might disagree with this statement. Serving on the council, however, allowed me to see things I had not seen before. Council members and staff, and in particular the council chair at the time, John Now, worked hard to address these problems, and I think we were able to move the ball a little bit forward. I left the council in 2011 when my second term was over, and I will be forever grateful for the opportunity. And out in the world, in today's world, I do think things have changed. Maybe not enough, but I think there is some change. More than a decade later, at least in my field of archaeology, the number of indigenous archaeologists as an important demographic of the discipline has grown significantly, including people who are either indigenous themselves or who work closely with indigenous communities. While there are still some old diehards in the ranks who may never learn, with the rising generation, it is no longer meet the new boss, same as the old boss, but increasingly, the kids are all right. I hope you get that reference. As I prepared my remarks for today, all the while fretting about what more I could add to what our already distinguished speakers for today have already said, I asked Chief Ann who had registered to attend. Who would the audience be? The tribe shared a list of registrants and their affiliation, and I realized that my remarks would be, for tribal members, akin to preaching to the choir. For non-tribal members, individuals who work in state and federal regulatory agencies or in museums or in academic institutions, maybe I will have something to offer as you think about how you will implement legal big C consultation or little c engagement, maybe we'll call it little e engagement with Virginia's tribes. And I can share my own observations and things to consider in this new world. There are many reasons to undertake consultation if you are an agency, or to engage if you are an institution such as a museum that controls or manages cultural resources in your work. It may be the legally required thing to do. It is certainly the ethical thing to do. And it's the smart thing to do, given that tribes have unique expertise to inform an agency's decision-making. For example, under Section 106, the first step to do is to determine if a cultural resource you manage is a historic property. Not all cultural resources are historic properties. Now we know that we all know that cultural resources are non-renewable physical evidence of past human activity, including sites, structures, objects, landscapes, view sheds that are important to a culture or community. But here's where historic properties moves away from that. And this is a really critical difference that I didn't realize until I got onto the council. Historic properties are more than this. They are those properties that are listed on the National Register of Historic Places or eligible for listing on the National Register. In the federal system, a cultural resource may not be a historic property and therefore not accorded protection under the National Historic Preservation Act. It will be interesting to see if Virginia adopts this position. In any case, it means that everyone involved in the process must have a strong familiarity with the National Register, and not just with that old archaeology default of Criterion D. Before I get too far down the pike, however, and because most of my work with tribes has been engagement and not Big C consultation, and because land and oral history for so many tribes are the archives, I have two examples to share with you about what is at stake in these conversations about cultural resources and why consultation with the Big C is important. The two examples come out of work with the Rappahannocks, and in the case of one project, with the Rappahannocks and the Pamunkeys. These examples show how listening to tribal experts, which is to say tribal members, can transform how we understand Virginia and American history. The decisions a land managing agency makes, even if it seems small at the time, those decisions contributes to this work, even if it may not be immediately apparent. The first example involves a project that Scott Strickland, and I know some of you know Scott, that he and I did with the Rappahannock tribe for the National Park Service's Captain John Smith Chesapeake National Historic Trail. The purpose was to produce an account of the historic and contemporary Rappahannock landscape so that NPS could use this information in their management and public interpretation of the Chesapeake Trail. We spent several weeks, many weeks actually, with the Rappahannocks mapping their landscape, listening to stories about the places we visited, bringing in archaeological evidence, downloading environmental data, and so on. It was a really productive project. We also did it with Upper Mattaponi, the Pamunkey, and the Piscataway in Maryland. And these reports can be found online. What we didn't expect how that small project, in the case of the Rappahannocks, would challenge long-rooted thinking about the Rappahannock tribe and its role in American history. Now, one of the old saws of Chesapeake historiography is that the Rappahannocks lived in fear of their neighbors to the south, the Powhatans. The proof of this assertion is said to be found in the map John Smith of Chesapeake Trail fame made in 1608 that shows nearly all of the Rappahannock settlements on the north bank of the Rappahannock River, when, and this is important, good soil is available on both sides. So why aren't they on the other side, on the south side? Why, historians asked, would these communities not establish towns on the south side if the soil was so good? Obviously, these historians argued, the Rappahannocks were hunkered down in fear, putting a river between themselves and the Powhatans. Now, the settlers had written a lot about Wahan-Seneca in the early decade, so the settlers are doing the writing here, making him out to be violent and expansive. And just as an aside, I want to say, one could ask if this was on the part of the colonists projecting. Who benefits from this writing, and how was this rhetoric going to be used to justify European expansion? But that's a rabbit hole for another day. At any rate, the point is, taken at face value, this interpretation made sense to historians and archaeologists. This narrative began circulating in scholarly circles in 1907. It's been around for a while. And it was an interpretation that I was aware of when we began our work with the tribe in 2016. And I had no reason to question it. That is, until Scott and I listened to the Rappahannocks tell us that that understanding was simply not true. That Rappahannock communities moved back and forth across the river, that Smith's map was little more than an example of seasonal timing. Remember, he's only in the river valley for a month or two. That the river was the highway and the food store and not any kind of defensive boundary. Further, the relationship between the Rappahannocks and Powhatans was one of diplomatically friendly nations. tribal members knew of this North Bank fear model, and they strongly disagreed with it. So as we went about our mapping project, which involved, as I said earlier, collecting tribal stories and many megabytes of online data, as well as a lot of heavy-duty geographic information systems lifting, the maps we produced revealed something very clearly. Level sandy loams, which were highly desirable for maize agriculture, do occur on both banks of the river. But good soils were only part of the equation. They were only part of the Rappahannock's decision-making process when it came to locating large towns. Access to marshes, to wetlands, and navigable waterways was also important for locating summer settlements. This map, and it's a GIS map, and I'll be the first to say that, I've had to stare at these things for a long time, and I still see new things. So I realize that it may not be the most exciting map, but it is an important map. It shows the Rappahannock River with the black color representing the areas where marshes, wetlands, and navigable waterways occur together in greater frequency and in closer association, and you can see that on the north bank of the Rappahannock River than they do on the south bank, making the north bank much more desirable for the towns seen and mapped by Smith in the summer of 1608. This finding, which really does challenge this old saw about Virginia indigenous history, reveals the danger of charting indigenous histories solely through an archive created by people with an agenda. A long game agenda, but an agenda focused on the dispossession of native land. The resulting interpretation, without indigenous input, trivializes and misrepresents, in this case, Rappahannock history. The approach has literally written the Rappahannocks out of American history, a 20th century form of dispossession. The second example concerns a project done in collaboration with the Rappahannocks and the Pamunkeys, and focuses on Bacon's Rebellion, an insurrection carried out by Nathaniel Bacon in 1676. Now, Virginia tribes are very familiar, I know, with Bacon's Rebellion, in part because Nathaniel Bacon declared war on all Virginia tribes in 1676, including those nations in tributary and diplomatic status with the colony, but also because of the 1677 Treaty of Middle Plantation that I think was discussed earlier, which guaranteed to signatory tribes some control over their traditional homelands, hunting and fishing rights, and so on, of course, as long as the tribes maintain their loyalty to the English crown. Now, historians have obsessed over Bacon and Bacon's Rebellion. There are tons of books and articles out there. And almost all histories have some version in their pages of, quote, Bacon ran the tribes into the Dragon Swamp, and that's the end of it. The use of the term swamp carries with it Western connotations that suggest this part of the story deserves no further consideration. We all know what being run into the swamp means. But Dragon Swamp, in reality, is a nearly 40-mile ecologically rich waterway that feeds the Piankatank River in Virginia's Middle Peninsula. It remains to this day a landscape known for its wildlife and plant life, and the place is littered with hunt clubs. And I think that says something. But none of this is taken into account by most of the people who have written about Bacon's Rebellion, perhaps because the documents are limited and therefore limiting in how indigenous agency, knowledge, and creativity are understood. So what can an indigenous history of Bacon's Rebellion reveal? To write an indigenous history of Bacon's Rebellion requires other sources. And this is going to be no surprise to you all, in addition to the written ones, especially tribal knowledge, including not just historical knowledge of the event, but place and ecological knowledge. A team effort involving staff and tribal members from both the Pamunkeys and Rappahannocks, a GIS specialist, the Friends of Dragon Run as our travel agent into the Dragon, for hikes and paddles so that we could engage the landscape, a retired military intelligence officer, Jeff Wright, who really gave us a great shot in the arm for these interpretations, and members and staff of the Pamunkey Indian Nation and the Rappahannock tribe came together to prepare this history. The team recorded everything we heard from tribal members and also from the retired Army intelligence officer and took gobs of notes about the environment. When we got to the other side of this effort, and we're writing it up now, it's due at the end of the year, we found a very different indigenous history of Bacon's rebellion than Bacon chased the tribes into the swamp trope. Under the leadership of Kokakowski, the tribes hadn't fled into Dragon Swamp at all, but rather chose to prepare in the Dragon months before Bacon's assault, as they foresaw the danger, probably establishing best sites to locate for the duration. And until Bacon arrived in September, the natives moved between their towns closer to the York River and the Dragon. And so they were just simply preparing. They were in preparation mode. And when Bacon and his ragtag forces came after the native people remained secluded on dry, defensible land, while Bacon's men went down dead end after dead end, becoming repeatedly mired in swamp water and generally staying wet all day, every day. To use the term our military intelligence consultant, Mr. Wright, shared with us, the native warriors traded space for time. The Pamunkeys and Rappahannocks knew the Dragon, and they knew the surrounding landscape and pass. They also honored their end of the diplomatic relationship with Virginia by not killing any of these people coming after them. The swamp seemed to be taking care of that anyway. And their losses were fairly minimal, given that Bacon set out to kill all native people and the English government was of absolutely no assistance. Now, in some ways, both of these projects, which I could talk about forever, might sound like an interesting and worthwhile project, but really, how does this relate to Big C consultation that we're talking about today? Such discoveries may be all well and good, but how does that help an agency with multiple stakeholders? And by the way, I don't include tribes as stakeholders. Their relationship is different, government to government. But these other multiple stakeholders who may be breathing down the agency's neck for their permit or whatever. The Bacon project, however, actually grew out of one of these projects. We were spurred to action by reports that Dominion Power was replacing Line 224, an aging 230 kilovolt electric transmission line located in New Kent, King William, King and Queen, Essex, and Richmond counties. Now, this line has been in service for nearly 50 years. And to maintain reliable service, and we all know how that is important, Dominion is compelled to bring this line up to modern standards. At the time the project was reviewed, we only knew that the tribes had fled into the Dragon and that the power line crosses Dragon Run. With our new understanding now, we now know that the power line corridor skirts one of the high probability locations for where the Pamunkeys and Rappahannocks established their secluded position. As Kendall Stevens, Cultural Resources Director for the Pamunkey Indian Tribe notes, these kinds of studies can serve future decision-making from an informed position. Revisionist history and the actions of land managing companies and agencies, where many of you are affiliated with, are closer. These things are closer together than they might at first appear. Changing gears, on April 17, 2024, the Virginia Assembly enacted House Bill 1157, quote, federally recognized tribal nations in the Commonwealth, agencies to consult on permits and reviews. This new law, which went into effect on July 1, requires the Secretary of the I got all my information off the internet, so if I'm wrong, just tell me afterwards. It requires the Secretary of the Commonwealth to designate, in consultation with federally recognized tribes in Virginia, an ombudsman for tribal consultation. To the tribes and their allies, you deserve a sincere congratulations for having brought this law into reality. It was not a foregone conclusion. I am not an attorney by any standard, but my reading of this new law is that by January 1st, 2025, the State Departments called out in the Act, including Conservation and Recreation, Environmental Quality and Historic Resources, and the Marine Resources Commission, are to adopt regulations necessary to carry out the new law. That's like in 3 months. The ombudsman, which appears to be a cabinet level or near cabinet level position, is to facilitate communication between federally recognized tribes and relevant state agencies and local governments for consultation on environmental, cultural, and historical permits and reviews, and to assist the named state agencies in developing policies and procedures to ensure meaningful and appropriate consultation with the tribes regarding permits and reviews. And I know much of this has been discussed earlier today. But for Virginia, this is a real game changer. While many major public works projects at the state level often do go on to require federal permitting, thus triggering Section 106, not all do. And this law will provide some protection so that environmental or cultural features important to tribes are considered in the review process by directly involving the tribes in truly the earliest stages of project development. Even more important, at least in my experience, a few sophisticated, some might call them crafty, applicants may have previously attempted to use the old state review process without consultation to take care of their Section 106 responsibilities, but in a manner that later avoids triggering 106. And so this, I think, is going to put a stop or certainly a slowdown to that. As the state moves to implement the new law, fortunately for those state agencies that might wonder what this means, I direct you to the resource pages of the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation and also the National Association of Tribal Historic Preservation Officers, or NAHPO. They're a great place to start to see how consultation is handled or is to be handled. And again, to re-watch the presentations from this morning. Here are some principles I was able to abstract from those documents. The very first, and again, preaching to the choir, is the recognition of the government-to-government relationship between the United States and federally recognized tribes. This relationship acknowledges tribal sovereignty and self-governance. This relationship also holds true between states and tribes. The government-to-government relationship between the federal government and tribes, and in Virginia between the state and tribes, is rooted in American history. It's not some, nouveau invention, but it is rooted in American history and often includes treaty agreements such as that Treaty of Middle Plantation. In these situations, that is government-to-government situations, heads of government or their designee, I assume this might be the ombudsman, but I don't know, would liaison with the tribes. But we need to know, right? We need to figure out how this is going to actually work on the ground. But agencies will need to support the ombudsman. This person cannot do all that is outlined in the law alone. Agencies can help by learning everything you can do, or you can by reading the materials on the Council's and NAHPO's websites. And this is key, beginning or expanding conversations with tribes. And I know many of agencies, DHR, for example, has been having long conversations, has been having conversations with tribes for a long while. But building relationships with tribes is going to be the best thing that can be done to implement the law as intended. You don't want to become that box that gets checked. Now, the ACHP defines consultation as the process of seeking, discussing, and considering the views of other participants, and where feasible, seeking agreement with them in matters arising in the Section 106 process. I'm going to talk a little bit about Section 106 in a couple minutes, but NAHPO says essentially the same thing except the last clause. They say it's the process of seeking, discussing, and considering the views of other participants, and where feasible, seeking agreement with them regarding, and they say how historic properties should be identified, considered, and managed. I assume that the state regulations due in 3 months will adopt similar language. Also very important, consultation is more than simply sending an email, leaving a voicemail message, and just saying, hey, we're going to do this. The ACHP and NATHPO both view consultation as a process of communication that may include written correspondence, meetings, telephone conferences, site visits, emails, their list goes on. And they both agree that consultation must begin early. Now, I did find on NATHPO's website, and you may be very interested in reading this, it's a little dated, it came out in 2005, so it's about 20 years old. NATHPO undertook a survey of TIPO offices countrywide to ask, what do you think constitutes successful consultation? And so even though it is now 20 years old, I think that there are some principles and points that are relevant today. This is coming from tribes across the country, members of NATHPO. And so they have TIPO offices. True government, this is what they say, true government-to-government contact between the agency and the tribe, with high-level agency representatives meeting with tribal leaders. And we heard that this morning. You know, don't send the intern. This is government to government. And the ombudsman may only partially fulfill this role. I'm not sure. And if the ombudsman is to be that high-level agency representative, he or she is going to probably have their hands full. Early coordination and an early effort to identify the areas of concern to the tribes. And, you know, we can say that's such a good thing, but how many times, Chief Ann, do we get emails that something's well along in the pipeline, and we're like, what? Multiple contacts throughout the project and in different spaces. In other words, tribes didn't want you to just come to the tribal center or go to their office, but to meet in different places. In those places, but maybe at the site, you know, to really begin to vary situations that actually leads towards relationship building. Formal and informal meetings. Facilitators for the sessions should alternate between either agency or tribal leaders, providing tribes full and candid information prior to the first meeting. It's really sad that they had to say this, right? That they had to say, tell us everything, be fully transparent. And then also agencies have a tribal liaison if you can. And perhaps most importantly, the agency's fostering of a relationship. This is what those tribal historic preservation officers said. It's not just arriving at an agreement or a disagreement. That is not the end in itself. The end is developing the relationship. Also important is the recognition of certain truisms when working with tribes. I have found the notion and practice of reciprocity critically important in engaging and consulting with any community, really, but especially tribes. As someone who works in state government, St. Mary's College is not a private Catholic girls' school, but it is a public state school. I know how challenging it can be, for example, to offer refreshments to people. You're getting sodas, you better give us a list of everybody that was there. Or give honoraria, and so on. But tribes have expertise. The examples I use show that. We heard it this morning. And just like any agency official rightly expects to be compensated for their work, so too should tribal experts. And speaking of state agencies, I note that bureaucracies, as if we often stereotype them, have you ever not been caught in bureaucratic hell? As dissociated cubbies of workers are not always the best problem solvers and may in fact lead to more problems because of poor communication or failure to take responsibility. From my short dive into industrial psychology, I'm an expert now, and that is psychologists who focus on who focus on the workplace and the behavior of employees. I found that there are a lot of researchers out there who argue for what they call a relational bureaucracy, a model that structures reciprocity in the workplace between customers, workers, and managers. Now, I don't think that tribes are customers, but you could see how this model could apply to help with relationship building. This model, which comes out of the organizational world, may be useful for thinking about those agencies that are tasked with this new law, about building these relationships with tribes for whom reciprocity is a core value. And finally, one other point. For those of you who have worked with Section 106 projects at the federal level, and this always seems to be a surprise out in the world, you know that of all the things Section 106 does in less than 100 words, it does not prescribe an outcome. And it appears this may be true for the new Virginia law. In other words, the road project may still go through, the site may be demolished, there could be alternative mitigation. Section 106 does not prescribe an outcome. Because an outcome is not prescribed, makes it all the more critical that consultation is started early. Being a by right consulting party does not necessarily mean a tribe or any stakeholder will or will not be successful in the process. But to be successful, you must be there early. And if you disagree with the final decision, as we saw this morning, you can always use the courts, but it is very expensive. As I outline all of these points, I do want to remind everyone that I am not an attorney, nor do I work for a CRM firm or a regulatory agency. Why did you ask me to come? But my goal working with the tribes is to make sure that information the Rappahannock tribe needs from me to support their case, whatever it is they get. And I hope the same happens with this new Virginia law. Thank you very much.
Okay, so we are a little bit ahead of time, and I'm going to invite Eric Jason up to the podium. Eric, are you? Oh, you're here. Okay. All right. Okay. And I'm going to need your help on some pronunciations because I want to do it right. I want to do it justice. So Eric is here we've been having a couple of different perspectives on consultation in terms of really, from a cultural, historical perspective, how those histories that we all hold and those databases that we all hold are not necessarily perhaps the truth. But Eric actually works for the National Park Service, and he is one of these liaisons. He is a tribal liaison and the Native Affairs Officer for the Northeast region of the National Park Service, and he's held this position since 2021. So please welcome Eric Chasen to the microphone. Thank you.
So I've got my beverage up here. I was concerned last night that I could be amongst some of the folks that weren't able to present. So I want to start by thanking my wife for taking care of me from afar through Uber with soup and tea last night, and I turned the corner and felt much better this morning. But in fairness to sort of a general feeling of being borderline sick comes with the territory of also being a new father. So. Right. So I'd like to also thank my wife for taking care of young Henry James. That allows me to be here, and also allowed me to participate as a trainer in an internal training that we ran last week at Fire Island National Seashore in Long Island. So it's a lot to ask of her, and I'll sort of start by thanking my wife. I'll go on to to thank our presenters from USET for reminding me and all of the other Park Service folks in this room, or any of the folks who work perhaps at federal land managing agencies, just the level of responsibility that comes with that. So thank you to them for their remarks, and thank you to Chief Ann and the organizers here, Rappahannock Tribe and others, for this invitation to give these remarks. It's in a sense for me, it's almost like a culmination. That's not the right or best word, but as Melissa had mentioned, I've been in this role as the Northeast Region's Native Affairs Officer, tribal liaison, for 3 years, and so here I'm sort of reaching in the agency jargon my full performance level, and this is part of my responsibilities to be out here supporting the tribes in events like this, but also performing where that is appropriate. The public educative function that I consider also very close, an important feature of the trust responsibility that all federal agencies are infused with. In preparing for this event, we spent time talking about what would be useful or important to do here, particularly in terms of bringing a little bit of the agency perspective to these issues. There's a lot going on in this space, a lot that's operating sort of in the background, and I'll acknowledge here too the significance of this law here in the Commonwealth, this tribal consultation law. That is a really important development, and what I wanted to do was to sort of direct some remarks that are sort of in the spirit of this state consultation law, but also to continue in this theme of partnership, and to sort of do some to engage here in maybe make an invitation to folks to be forward-looking in terms of what a trust responsibility needs to look like, but in the 21st century, but also in terms of the challenges that are confronting all of us, particularly when we're talking about things like climate change, and so the presentation will have that in mind as well. I am Mi'kmaq. I am enrolled at Eskasoni, the First Nation of Mi'kmaq, in northern Nova Scotia, on Cape Breton. As I was sort of preparing for the presentation and sitting here listening to the presentations this morning, I was also thinking back to this event last year, where the natural resource director from USET was describing some of the shared or familiar history, the sort of experiences that are shared between the tribes here in Virginia and the Wabanaki tribes in Maine, probably in terms of both their pathways to federal recognition, but also some of the experiences that are endured in those places. You know, some of the presenters here have touched on some of those things, whether it's and the Park Service has recently published a study looking at segregation in public lands in Virginia. I know that part of the history that is grappled with here is with things like eugenics or census manipulation. And you know that for me is familiar too. Sort of when I was able to access higher education, right, for the first time, a lot of that had to do with a land settlement act with the tribes in the state of Maine. So eventually I found myself at the School of Public Policy, and this was around, I think this is 2012, and the work had gotten off the ground for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was forming there, and there's a training that maybe some folks here have participated in, but the Park Service has been able to run in some different regions for particularly for superintendents. This is a training designed by the Upstander Academy out of Boston, and what it's based on is that following the process of that TRC. And so, what does it describe or capture? Things like my grandmother's generation's experience with boarding schools, or my mother's generation's experience with the foster care system, policies around foster care in particular. And so back to familiar experiences. You know, what I think is clear is shared here and in so many communities across Indian country is this work of revitalization, reclaiming, restoration, and I think that the agencies have a really important role in that work. So I wanted to talk here on this slide too about my role in the Northeast, and what I think is, I'm appreciative too for some of the remarks by other presenters, because it's set up pretty well for me. Some of different things that I'll touch on in this presentation. But I think that what's important to know or understand about the creation of a role like the one that I am in. I just finished my third year in the role, is that the Northeast recognized that there is so there are problems with historically tribal consultation responsibilities being primarily supported from the regional level by cultural anthropology. This is historically sort of how that had been done in the agencies, in the Park Service in particular, and a lot of that was centered on Section 106. So I think that you probably would also have found historically more of a box-checking kind of approach in sort of conducting that consultation in a way that satisfies the legal standard, which isn't always necessarily that difficult to do, especially well, we'll leave it there. Maybe return to that later. This is a snapshot of the Northeast region. What does it describe? It describes 83 parks across 13 states, 23 national heritage areas, over 1,000 national historic landmarks. It also describes, and here that sort of that box there, the green box in the bottom in the middle. I think it's fair to say that that describes our region's present accounting, if you will, of the relationships that our region has with 47 federally recognized tribes and many other state-recognized tribes and traditionally associated communities. It's sort of a term that comes out of Park Service policy. But I think that what's sort of important about that, or something we should say something about, is that number is subject to change. Relationships with 47 federally recognized tribes. That's based on present understandings of cultural associations with spaces. But I think the point here of what we're talking about in this conference is that there's a lot more work that always needs to be done in consultation. It's an ongoing process. It doesn't end. So I would expect that in the future, a similar sort of graphic like this would look and will look different. The other sort of things that I think are important to say something about on this slide are the dollar figures associated with park visitation. I think it's important to talk a little bit about, or just at least bring our awareness to the Native Act, which is about cultural tourism, and the directive, the fact that it's a directive to federal tourism assets, if you will, to be engaging with tribal nations, with indigenous communities, to coordinate in the realm of cultural tourism, and this is an important aspect of what it means to support Indian self-determination in partnership. So that's sort of an interesting figure about the sorts of economic activity that is generated in park visitation that tribes ought to be participating in, and that needs to occur through consultation or that understanding about what exactly that might look like is something that needs to be occurring in consultation. The other sort of square there that I think is interesting to talk about and think a little bit about too are the 40 million museum and archival items that are maintained, protected, made accessible. I think what's important to say there is that we ought to also be understanding both a trust responsibility to the tribal nations, because I think that there are probably many instances across the Northeast region where the nations may not necessarily know that cultural items or other archival items with implications for their histories and the like are maintained in park spaces. And I think that some of our other presenters described the narratives, the narratives that are absent, probably often from maybe some of our public curriculums. And what I'd sort of say here too is that, in looking at this role, or in being attracted to the role, I think that what I liked about the Park Service was this idea, which is an important one, that it often describes itself, because this is the case, as the nation's largest public education corps. I think that there's a lot of responsibility in that, and a lot of important work still to do to ensure that the park system, and the way that it's constructed, and the way that it may change over time, is working in consultation with tribal nations to ensure that the sorts of narratives that it's involved in producing and reproducing are accurate and reflect tribal histories and stories and narratives as understood by the tribes themselves. I guess I'd like to say more here too about so there's sort of this block here that describes 1.5 million acres of land, 930 miles of coastal shoreline, and 80 plus thousand acres of wilderness. I guess what I would say about that is that it describes, I think, the holdings of the agency in the Northeast, but what it doesn't, I think, fully capture is the influence through relationship with other partners, other land managers at the state level, other sort of federal land managers, which is to say that there's great potential too in the ability to influence, have influence on the management of potentially a much larger amount of land. And I think that's an important thing to also be thinking about in the future, where we ought to be thinking about what does the trust responsibility to Indians mean in the 21st century, and what role is there for walking with, if you're the federal government, walking with tribal nation partners sort of across the fabric of cooperative federalism, if you will, into these sorts of spaces, and conversations about landscape level approaches to resource management, which we'll say more about. So this is another way of, I guess, visualizing the Northeast region. I think it's not the best map, but bear with me. All of the black dots represent the park units. The shaded areas, those are the heritage areas, the national heritage areas, which are in closely supported by the Park Service. I think that what I wanted to talk about here too were those white spaces that are not necessarily defined, and certainly not controlled by a federal land managing agency like the Park Service. But I think I would go back to some of what I was saying earlier, that those are spaces of that are important to, you know, or let's sort of to say it differently. One of the themes in the title to this presentation was this idea of rethinking consultation, and part of that, I think, is an invitation to think about what it means to move beyond and maybe outside of the boundaries of the lands that the Park Service manages, but also that other sort of federal agencies are managing, and to think about what is not only possible but will be important, particularly as sort of the effects or the realities of a changing climate become more apparent, and as three sovereigns in our constitutional system, each with responsibilities to our own publics, that we need to be thinking about the sorts of relationships that will be important, and we'll visit this idea of wicked problems. One of the other presenters had brought up biodiversity loss. And this is sort of the classically wicked problem. But I think that what I wanted to sort of suggest here is that, you know, particularly with the white spaces that we see on a map like this, those are also spaces that we ought to be thinking about in terms of the potential for the kinds of relationships that we're seeing emerging here in Virginia as a good example with this state consultation law. I think that I've had the benefit of other presenters sort of describing some of the history and more recent history and process of updating consultation policy in the particularly I would be speaking to in the Department of Interior. So what's sort of important to know about that? Well, I think that it's crucial that it better aligns with sovereignty and self-governance, and how is it doing that? I think that some of the language in the updated policy is more inclusive of federally recognized tribes' governance structures and preferred methods of consultation. I think one of our presenters had put up on the screen the diagram that admittedly is buried in that departmental manual that describes this consensus-seeking requirement, and sort of what it's meant to suggest, I think, is that the closer you're moving to a core interest and concern of sovereign nations, the greater the expectation is that you are reaching consensus and making that progress toward consent. You know, we had several presenters really emphasize the importance of consent. Other improved features are the dispute resolution processes, right? This idea that I think that we probably have commentators note that this as policy is not necessarily always an avenue to legal recourse, but there are built into this policy improved dispute resolution processes to include, you know, the ways that disputes will elevate up decision chains to from superintendents to regional directors to the director of the Park Service, and then up to the department. It's not in the slide, but many in this room may be very aware of the Secretary's Tribal Advisory Council. That's also a feature of this policy. Others had described as well the increased transparency and accountability that's improved in the policy. What does that mean? It means the requirement for written explanations about how input was considered, how it influenced decisions. I think what's also important about new policy is that it stresses improved communication strategies amongst and coordination amongst federal agencies. We've talked today, several presenters talked today about the challenges around capacity and being overwhelmed by the amount of outreach and invitation to consultation that has been generated by this administration, perhaps with its emphasis, but also by things like the offshore energy projects. We know that there are several nations that really are burdened by the level of consultation that's involved, that's required for them to be able to protect their resources on the sea bottom as these projects move forward. There's another theme that several presenters had touched on, this idea of box checking, and here I'd like to talk a little bit about what it looks like in the Northeast to move beyond that sort of box checking approach, and some of the case studies that I wanted to talk a little bit about include the work that's. I'll begin with the work that's been going on in Maine at Katahdin Woods and Waters National Monument. I think too it's an example that speaks to another challenge, right? I would have loved to have brought that superintendent with me to this conference, because I think that the work there has been that important, and that relationship has really was taken on by that superintendent. But as happens, I think probably too frequently, I think it's an endemic problem in federal agencies, is that you have superintendents or other sort of managers that don't stay there necessarily for the long term, and there are different reasons for why that happens, and sometimes those are reasons of family and these sorts of things that we can understand. But I think that what the Katahdin Woods and Waters example speaks to too are some of the things that the agency can do and ought to be doing, and I think is learning how to do through work like that is ongoing at Katahdin Woods and Waters. The sorts of things that you can do to ensure continuity. and to protect those relationships where so much has been invested on both sides. The tribes have really invested in that work. The park staff are very invested in that work. What happens when those staff move on? Well, it can be disruptive, and so what are some of the things that we ought to be doing there? I think that Katahdin Woods and Waters speaks well to those things. So what are some of those things? And these are themes that came up at different points throughout the day. What's special about a space like Katahdin Woods and Waters is the level of engagement, of consultation from the very beginning. In some senses, Katahdin Woods and Waters is a little unique in that it was a donation. The park is 83,000 plus acres of land that was purchased privately and then donated to the Park Service in hopes of it becoming a national park. But that's not necessarily unique. That we see that in other spaces in the Northeast. What might be a little more unique is the use of reserved rights there to allow for that robust work with the tribes to design the visitor contact station there. And in the course of designing the visitor contact station, to also incorporate many different elements, cultural elements into different spaces and facets of the building. So it raises the question, as does the larger departmental policy, calling for directing agencies to incorporate traditional knowledge into decision making. So I think that the reasonable question to arise out of that directive is, well, how can you ensure the protection of indigenous cultural intellectual property, for instance? One way to sort of think about it, that might be reflected in a structure like that visitor contact station. So I think that what we were able to see at Katahdin was sustained work of consultation with departmental solicitors, with attorneys from the tribes, with park staff and regional staff, to develop that sort of initial framework for protecting, or at least one of the probably first efforts to understand what are the limits in terms of what the federal government is able to protect in a park, right? Because there are First Amendment concerns and all of the rest of these sorts of things that do place some limits on what the federal government can protect. But I think that what you find in the course of doing that work to arrive at such an agreement is that robust consultation becomes sort of structurally incorporated throughout the entire monument and the different processes that go on in the monument, whether that's things like the maintenance that go on, or there will be cultural tourism of different varieties that will go on, museum loan agreements, cultural demonstration, all of the different things that will happen in that park space. It's through agreements that really center an ongoing process of consultation, right? That I think is most important there, and that's reflected in this cultural intellectual property agreement, but also sort of the other agreements there, the general agreement, which is more of an overarching framework for understanding shared values and understandings and protocols around the work of co-stewardship and other sort of partnership work that will happen there. And so I think that I would sort of suggest that Katahdin Woods and Waters is one of our best examples in the Northeast of that. The other sort of case studies here that I wanted to talk about were the Fort Ontario Special Resource Study. So a special resource study, as my good colleague and friend Martha Droge, and if you're watching, Martha, hello, is she sort of describes it as a bit of a thought experiment. Typically, these special resource studies are things that are requested by members of Congress, and Park Service will take a look at a space and make a series of determinations about whether criteria are met, and this sort of thing. But I think that what the Fort Ontario Special Resource Study, which is something that's available online, if folks are interested. What's important about that is that I think it illustrates a few things. I think it illustrates that when consultation is well, first I think it illustrates the fact that an improved policy of consultation made it clear that yes, even with these speculative kind of, or more speculative kind of thought experiments about special resource studies and potential park units, even with those, consultation is required. And when that consultation is done well, as I think it was in this case of the Fort Ontario Special Resource Study, what that can do is result in proposed language to establish a unit. And if done well, that language reflects the perspectives, the interests of the associated tribal nations, which in this case are Haudenosaunee nations. And so what you sort of end up with is the language in proposed legislation that will facilitate that kind of meaningful work in the future, co-stewardship and otherwise. But also, when done well, what you've effectively done too is shaped the future of the park system in the Northeast, which, going back to sort of what I was saying earlier in terms of how the park system is set up and what kind of narratives it produces and reproduces, and the effect that has on the public awareness, consciousness, and even sort of imaginary about what is possible in the future. I think the other sort of thing it speaks to too is again the recognition that many tribal nations are confronted with issues of capacity, and so it can be challenging to engage with something that is more speculative, like a special resource study. And I think that it's incumbent on the agencies to do a much better job of coordinating amongst one another, but also making more efficient communication for the benefit of their tribal nation partners, the sorts of projects that that are coming down the pike. And we'll sort of say more about this. I'd like to talk a little bit about the Delaware Water Gap. And for some of us in the room who may have been at the NATHPO conference a little while back, you would have seen a presentation by, I believe, the Stockbridge Munsey's TIPO described the Archaeological Monitoring Field School that was a collaborative sort of endeavor between the Park Service and the three federally recognized Lenape tribes and Westchester University in Pennsylvania. I think what's important about that work is that it probably arises out of some of the larger projects, infrastructure projects that are going on across the Northeast region related to the Great American Outdoors Act. I think what's important about those projects, and I think that this case study sort of illustrates it quite well, is that because those are multi-year, large-scale projects, they also support this sustained consultation, and support the relationship building through that, and makes possible these sorts of efforts to support building the capacity that's needed to be able to meaningfully participate in these infrastructure projects where they're occurring across the region. I think that what it shows us too is that there are other projects on the natural resource side that will come down in the form of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, Inflation Reduction Act, and similarly, those will be multi-year, well-resourced projects that will support that sort of relationship building and present similar kinds of opportunities for capacity building, for different kinds of experiences or involvement in that work. It's one of the ways that the agency has been able to understand what it means for the Park Service to, in fact, support and to see what it means in terms of the agency's mission and the things that it does. How does it support capacity building or meet requests for technical assistance and the like? So, Park Service person coming here, I wanted to make sure to spend some time talking about Park Service initiatives, some of them, and wanted to start with America 250, or in the Northeast, Indigenous America 250 is an initiative that maybe some in this room are more familiar with. I think that what's important about that work is the idea that the country is, and the Park Service is preparing for this the semi-quincentennial, this 250th. I think what's interesting or important about the conversations leading up to that, where what was this open question? Is this a celebration, or is this a commemoration? And this is for some a complicated issue, but where the Northeast sort of came down was that this is a commemoration, and in fact it's important to understand and recognize that in the course of doing this work around the 250th, in telling the stories of the nation's founding, it's important to recognize that often what is absent from those stories are indigenous voices and perspectives on those events, which are often quite different than the narratives that many park units are set up to tell. And so America 250 and Indigenous America 250 in the Northeast is about ensuring that storytelling is far more inclusive than it has been in the past. But again, here we are at a conference about consultation, and I think that part of what is also involved in that is the need to recognize and better understand that there is a lot of work that is involved in even preparing for that kind of invitation to consult on events, and we've seen this in our regional context, that doing consultation around these things can itself be a re-traumatizing sort of exercise. So it's also incumbent on the agency to understand what needs to be involved in terms of preparation for conversations and work that can be just that, can be re-traumatizing or unsettling. And that sort of is internal work as well, I might suggest, for park staff who will be asked to tell particular narratives or stories differently than they may be accustomed to telling them, as those stories become more inclusive of Native Americans, of women, and of African Americans in this country. So other initiatives here on the slide, co-stewardship. Co-stewardship is about fulfilling the trust responsibility to Indian tribes in the management of federal lands and waters. That term co-stewardship, there was a lot of discussion around that sort of at the onset, and the ways in which that differs from co-management, because it does. Co-management is something that is typically legislated into a park, or if we're looking at other contexts like the Great Lakes or the Pacific Northwest, we might see co-management emerging from treaty and reserved rights and court decisions that are enforcing those. So co-stewardship is probably a broader and more flexible concept. But here too, I would return to that picture that I put up earlier on about a picture of the region, map of the region, and those white spaces that are not as well defined as being federally managed land. I think that it's the case that there is less federal land in the Northeast than perhaps in other regions. So what does that mean? I think that it means that in addition to the co-stewardship work that needs to occur in the park spaces, I think that there's incredible potential as well that we need to pursue as is, I would suggest, part of the conversation that arises out of passage of a state consultation law. What does it look like to do co-stewardship in partnership across and through those spaces of cooperative federalism. It's something that we need to spend a lot more time thinking about. Sort of the last sort of item on this slide is this new policy memorandum on landscape and seascape conservation, what the Park Service is describing as cooperative conservation. And I think that it speaks to that idea as well, that a lot of this work, especially in view of the challenges that we are all confronted with, the wicked problems, sea level rise or ocean acidification, degradation of the atmospheric trust. These sorts of things. They're vast problems, and they're not capable of resolution by the federal government alone by any means. And so I'm sort of inviting us here today to think about, what will prove increasingly important in terms of that cooperative work around whether it's co-stewardship or different kinds of conservation that will occur in those at least on this map, spaces that are less defined. So again, returning to this idea of landscape level co-stewardship, which is also, or to say differently, here are some sources of policy that inform some of what I'm saying about this, or rather echoing about it, because this is the policy of the department, and then sort of underneath in the smaller text you see the policy memorandums, the PMs. Those are the step down guidance. Sort of that's the work that the agency has to do to receive the guidance from the department, and then to do the work to interpret that guidance down into the programmatic and operational activities of the agency, and that's really important. And it doesn't, sort of at the bottom, I've listed there a secretarial order that is about Endangered Species Act, and this is a secretarial order that the late Charles Wilkinson had been very involved in. This is an order from '97. For me, this secretarial order kind of stands for that proposition that here's a great piece of policy that a lot of work went into developing, and it's not clear to me that the sort of step down guidance has been developed. I think that probably part of what informs that too is just the complexity around coordinating across boundaries and jurisdictions. But that's work that must occur, given the sorts of challenges that we're confronted with. The next slide there sort of names those challenges. Just the idea of wicked problems, and the classically wicked problem is biodiversity loss. What makes it wicked, or what makes a problem wicked? That typically it's hard to define, or to agree on definition, I suppose. To agree on the problem itself, and let alone what the solutions are, and then you have this additional problem of the interconnectivity of drivers, and the fact that this occurs across jurisdictions, across boundaries. So when you're talking about biodiversity loss too, you're talking about a body of federal natural resource law where the substantive goals are not necessarily primarily directed at biodiversity or even broader ecological health. That the sort of actors involved are decentralized, their jurisdictions are overlapping, and often, as Secretarial Order 3206 stands as an example for, the coordination is not there yet. And so what I like to sort of suggest here is that the bottom line is that wicked problems like biodiversity loss really do require that we take stock of all of our tools across sovereigns. You know, the federal government will have some of those tools. The tribes certainly have those tools, and so do the states. Wicked problems, I would sort of suggest, require that, and I think that is sort of, that's a conversation that you can begin to approach in a more serious way in a space like Virginia, where a consultation law has been successfully passed. I guess what I wanted to sort of say here is that, you know, while it's difficult, while it can be difficult to mark the boundaries of the relationship between the federal government and tribal nations, because at its broadest, the relationship is a mixture of legal duties, moral obligations, understandings, and expectancies that arose over the course of dealings, and that in its narrowest, the relationship approximates that of trustee and beneficiary. So you have this situation where commentators might make much ado about determining what type of fiduciary obligation are you talking about? Is this a legally enforceable duty? Is this a moral command? Which is it? What I think is important about wicked problems is that they don't make that kind of distinction. And what I've sort of invited us to do here today is to rethink consultation as something that exclusively occurs between sovereign tribal nations and the federal government. That is true, but there are three sovereigns under our system, and I think that the ancient concept of the trust is a useful one for thinking in terms of the interests that unite, or that all three sovereigns under our system share in common. I think that I've largely touched on what's on this slide about in terms of what we need to be thinking about in the future. But what I wanted to do was describe a little bit about what some of those mechanisms look like, but also like what we're saying here when we're talking about three sovereigns existing under our framework and having public trust obligations to their own citizens. I think what we're saying is that when we position, along with the federal government, tribes and the states, what we're suggesting is that entirely situates tribes in that framework. And what's important about that is that this is the opportunity. This is and when we're doing this work of co-stewardship or cooperative conservation, I think that there's a way in which what this work is about is a reinscription of tribal sovereignty across the landscape, but also a reinscription of different epistemologies, different cosmologies, and as epistemologies and cosmologies that may contain one way of thinking about is a different understanding of relationship to the natural world that is very important in any conversation about correcting imbalances or returning to a state of affairs where there is natural abundance available to the citizens of three distinct sovereigns. So I think that what I wanted to do was describe quickly what those mechanisms sort of are. And I think that they're most of them are pretty familiar to folks. We're talking about reserved rights to off-reservation resources. We're talking about the federal Indian trust obligation as another important mechanism. We're talking about, and we see that work going on here in Virginia already around land trusts and conservation easements. And I've been describing new Park Service policy to figure out cooperative conservation, right? And sovereign tribal governments, of course, are governmental partners, along with states in doing that work. And lastly, tribal sovereigns can create programs under federal environmental statutes. Here we're talking about those treatment as a state provisions that are important in terms of addressing dischargers of pollution and the like. And there are different examples of what this looks like in other contexts as well. But I think that what I wanted to do was to sort of return to this idea, this frame of thinking about of what it means to what is meaningfully, or if you're to imagine like what is the federal policy to support self-determination in partnership, like what does it mean to be meaningful? And I think that it very much is about co-stewardship and approaches to landscape level planning, right? As opposed to these sort of project by project, often box checking exercises. I think it means co-stewardship across cooperative federalism through those things like the treatment as a state provisions and coordination through Endangered Species Act and wildlife law. And I think also it means better understanding co-management and co-stewardship arising out of treaty and reserved rights. And I think the important thing to say here too is even in those instances where we've had several presenters here talk about ways in which old treaties were downplayed. Well, I think that's sort of where we think about consultation policy in the Department of Interior as the embodiment of the federal trust responsibility, and the tools that exist in that policy space are also available for understanding. Well, what does it mean to pursue restorative justice or reparative justice, particularly in those instances where some actors are dismissive toward treaties. So I'd like to conclude by thanking Chief Ann and the event organizers here for the opportunity to be part of this very meaningful event. And it's one that I look forward to being a part of and supporting for many years to come. Thank you.
It's made me think about many opportunities with existing National Historic Park sites like Werowocomoco and the relationship with the tribe, as well as potential proposed legislation for new potential park sites and units. We are going to, I'm going to actually sort of do a mea culpa here, which is I asked our board to stay for a board meeting, and I'm trying to shift it a little bit earlier. So we're actually going to do some very quick closing remarks. I'll do the quick closing remarks, and then we're going to invite the drum group to come and give us a final song to close out this meeting. And I just wanted to say thank you all for coming, for being here on the phone and online. I guess that just showed my age. Sorry. On the internet. And we've had such a wonderful conference, and I was just reflecting about where we were a year ago and the kinds of conversations we were having and how much progress has been made in such a year. And, you know, all of the wonderful things that tribes are doing, including, you know, the Monacan Indian Nation putting together the first climate priority action plan, and the Rappahannock tribe really getting an America the Beautiful Challenge grant, which was one of the first in the region from across the nation. And, you know, all of the great work and that has been done to date, including the consultation law that we were here to talk about in exquisite detail. And so many of us really do want to know how that is going to work. And we look forward to the partnership to come. So I hope this conference has given you more information, best practices, grounding, context, knowledge, you know, new language to talk about how consultation operates between sovereigns, the importance really of engaging tribal nations often and early to really support them in protecting these sacred sites that matter to them, creating a partnership really so that we can create benefits for all citizens and for all sovereigns. I hope to see you for the 5th annual conference of the Sovereign Nations of Virginia, and I just wanted to thank everyone for your participation, for your good thinking and the spirit in which you came into this room. And so with that, I would like to invite the Musqueam drummers to sing us out.